thank you for joining us today for this, the third and final event of VIU's Arts and Humanities Colloquium Series for Spring 2017. My name is Dr. Tim Lewis. I'm the chair of the VIU History Department, and I'm your moderator for today's session. But our true hosts today and every day are the people of the Sunemo First Nation, on whose traditional territory we have the great privilege of meeting this morning. Please be mindful of that fact. I also want to take some time to acknowledge the funding provided by the colloquium series by the Office of the Dean of Arts and Humanities, headed by Dr. Ross Mckay. Now, if you were here last time, I shook things up a bit and paid tribute to Ross with a little bit of a poem. It was rather well received, and because I don't need much encouragement, I've decided to carry on the tradition of thanking Ross in slightly creative ways. This time, the genre is classic 1960s television theme songs. So here goes. Now come and listen to my story about a man named Ross. He is the Dean of Arts, he's my really good boss. And when the colloquium was in need of cash, he coughed it up and he coughed it up fast. Gave us just what we needed, a bit of gold so we could serve coffee, cookies, and tea. Well, the next thing you know, we got ourselves some talks by some clever academics who think outside the box. But they would never happen, no, this would never be, if it weren't for the money presented by our Dean of Arts and Humanities, that is, Dr. Ross Mckay. We don't need swimming pools or movie stars, because we got Ross, and Ross is boss. There we go. Thank you, thank you. I must warn you, though, that the rest of today's proceedings will be just a bit more highbrow than that. Speaking of which, it is now my distinct pleasure, actually, to introduce you to the man who I've just celebrated in song, Dr. Ross Mckay, who wants to share a few words with us as the colloquium concludes another successful season. So, Dr. Ross Mckay.
I don't know if I should say anything. Maybe I should just leave it at that. Thank you for joining us for the last lecture of the 2016-17 Arts and Humanities Colloquium Series. Since its beginning in 2009, the colloquium has built working connections and engendered conversations about ideas among members of the Arts and Humanities faculty and their communities, both at VIU and within the region. Our presenters have shown how important the arts and humanities are to understanding today's world. From across VIU, administrators, staff, and faculty have joined us to welcome audiences, introduce speakers, and thank them. Behind the scenes, individuals from diverse areas of VIU and from supportive community groups have gone out of their way to promote our events. For all the support we have had, the Arts and Humanities faculty would like to say thank you. Through this series, we simply try to share with the university community and the general public the essential work that we do. More important, we demonstrate to our students that the work is valued not only within the academy, but in society as well. This work explores questions and themes, often provocative ones, that we do not always see presented in mainstream culture. Most of my colleagues consider it a duty to share such work with the wider community. This public spirit, if you will, has been repaid in kind by the great support of our community in these proceedings. Our large and growing audience from outside the institution, the Friends of Arts and Humanities Colloquium, have joined us at multiple events each year, contributing their insights and observations to lively discussions. An active and an interested audience has made these events increasingly worthwhile, and I want to express my deep appreciation to our community members who continue to support this series. Perhaps now more than ever, we need the arts and humanities to lead us. They bring insight into human behavior, they ask the critical questions, they attempt to make sense of the past in order to build a rational future, and they synthesize new developments from every field of human endeavor. In short, they provide an organizing framework and a narrative shape that enables us to assimilate complexity and make good judgments and decisions. Therefore, can we finally dispense with silly misconceptions of the utilitarian value of liberal arts and simply permit them to serve their crucial function to help lead us out of the darkness of reductionism, prejudice, and pessimism? As the writer Toni Morrison recently said, now is precisely the time when artists must go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. With this in mind, I can hardly conceive of a more appropriate presentation than the one we are about to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross, for those kind words. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Joy Googler from VIU's Department of Media Studies as she introduces her colleague and today's featured speaker, Dr. Debra Pentecost, who will lead us beyond the boundaries of image and text to examine and the telling of difficult stories. Professor Googler.
Good morning. It is my distinct pleasure to be here today and to follow Dean Mckay and to be invited by the Colloquium Committee to join our fellow faculty, students, and members of the public. It's also a privilege to be on Sinemu First Nations territory and to introduce my colleague in media studies and close friend of 7 years, Debra Pentecost. Though she is known for her zeal for research, this task took a little sleuthing of my own and underscored an unspoken truth of academia. We so rarely research those with whom we work. Too often are stolen snatches of conversation at the photocopier, madly dashing to the ferry or over a celebratory glass of wine. Snatches of conversation, for sure, makes us think that we know our peers from campus meetings and events, and we fail to investigate beyond what reinforces the self-affirming bias. But shake a 13-page resume and all manner of conversational prompts land at your feet. False modesty be damned. For example, I knew Deborah had a BA and PhD in communications from our shared alma mater, SFU, and an MA in sociology from York, but I did not know she had received a Shirk Doctoral Fellowship, an Asper Media Studies Endowment, CanWest Graduate Scholarship, or grants for research and scholarly activity. I knew her as a fellow cinephile, obsessive, and current chair and professor for 11 years in our expanding media studies department. I knew she had earned shares in BC Ferries, dashing back and forth weekly across the strait for more than a decade to teach in the Department of Sociology at UBC. But I did not know she also taught history of documentary film at UVic, gender globalization and international politics for UBC Women's Studies, female roles in contemporary society for SFU Women's Studies, sociology and the family at Langara, communication and media at Royal Roads, and history of communication at the University College of the Fraser Valley. If this reads like an inter-institution registration wish list, you know you're in the right place. I knew she was frequently spotted in the staff room dragging her weight in essays for courses with titles like Media, Audience, and Society, Promotion, Persuasion, and Propaganda, Studies in Global Media, Film about Media, Public Relations, Advocacy, and Media, and Approaches to Media and Audience Research. But I did not know she had published in journals like Surveillance and Society, Mass Media Ethics, and Journal of Play and Culture. I knew we could spend hours ravaging Trump's terrifying buffoonery and the madness of a world in which a reality TV host and one percenter could get elected by blue-collar mid-America. But I did not know she relished these hot-button topics to such an extent that they peppered her course outlines as frequently as our casual chats. A quick review enters a dark world of all manner of sins: colonialism, neoliberalism, globalism, patterns of control and monopolization, cultural imperialism, political manipulation, desensitization, commodification, assimilation, poverty, racism, sexism, and blessedly, much reason for hope: international security, sustainable development, human rights, citizenship, peacekeeping, political activism, and forces for resistance and change. I knew she had many stamps in her passport for Cuba, Sweden, England, Scotland, and a worrying number for visits to Park City, Utah. but I did not know she was crossing borders and time zones to present at international conferences for documentary film and media, the International Association for Media and Communication Research, Visual Communication, Canadian Communication Association, International Visual Sociology Association, Documentary in the Moving Image, Transforming Audiences, Creativity, Knowledge, Participation, and the Third World Conference of War Correspondents, not to mention the Learneds. I knew she was on the board of directors and screening committee for the Doxa Documentary Film Festival for the last 8 years, and for Granville Island's own Creekview Housing Co-op, and that she'd attended the Gulf Islands Film and Television School. But I did not know that she had been a research associate for Media Watch, or done a collaborative performance piece with Sherry D. Wilson on images of war and the portrayal of death, dying, and suffering, which brings me to today. Deborah's presentation is entitled Beyond the Boundaries of Image and Text, Telling Difficult Stories, 2 words of which leapt out at me with respect to what I know of our presenter. She goes far beyond what is expected to her in any role she graces, and she relishes, with passionate fervor, wrestling with the difficult issues of today and of our past. She's not one to flinch in the face of the unfathomable. She seeks it out on film as inoculation, perhaps, to apathy, which she cannot abide. The images she brings into focus are not for the faint of heart, but they are necessary to ensure we still have one. Deborah's own heart is fully invested in this work, in her dedicated scholarship, committed teaching, concern for students, and in the Herculean weight that she endeavors to lighten through her sensitive and intelligent analysis, her dogged and exhaustive research, and her allegiance to courageous truth-telling, no matter the sacrifice. As a graduate of Carleton's journalism program, we've often discussed the values of truth and objectivity in news, I focusing on written reporting on and offline, and she the challenges photojournalists and documentary filmmakers have representing that truth when what they are witnessing is so far from the typical experience: war, conflict, and trauma, and requires such immersion it is near impossible to divorce self and story. It is precisely these powers and limitations when capturing the slippery reality of the events we pray are fiction that make the morning's lecture so fascinating and so timely. The task of introducing an upcoming presentation by an expert, when one is a dilettante at best and the genuine article is about to take the stage, is necessarily fraught, so I will stick to the math. This colloquium will tell difficult stories through the eyes of 2 documentary filmmakers and a photojournalist who together face 3 key challenges in their respective fields: rendering experiences beyond the realm of representation, principally extraordinary trauma, navigating ethical boundaries with respect to disturbing content, and giving visual expression to that which has been actively suppressed, often through political acts of erasure. To illustrate and investigate these 3 challenges, Deborah will share excerpts from the animated documentary Waltz with Bashir by Israeli filmmaker Ari Folman, the work of Cambodian filmmaker Rithi Pan, and his film The Missing Picture, which employs carved clay figurines to tell the story of the Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge, and the work of Susan Misalis and her book Kurdistan in the Shadow of History, featuring the words and images of missionaries, anthropologists, military personnel, Kurdish photographers, and newspaper stories to provide a textured portrait of the history of the Kurdish people. This is what I know, what I anticipate, and what I am certain will illuminate the darkness. Debra Pentecost is who I know, or thought I did. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
All right, so thank you for all of you. Thank you for the introductions. It's very lovely. It's a busy life. And thank you, all of you for coming out today and spending your Friday morning to listen to my talk. Joy has done a nice introduction, so I will probably just begin and cut out a little bit of what I was going to do to give a bit of context for my work. I have added a 4th film, so just when I go in, there's going to be also a film by Anka Damian called Krulak the Path to Beyond, so I'll introduce that when we get to it. But first, I'd like to begin my talk with a story. Several years ago, when my daughter was much younger, she was just 5, and I was busy with my PhD dissertation, Vicky Goldberg's book, The Power of Photography, lay amongst various papers and books that I had scattered around all my research. Surrounded by war photography for several years, I didn't give a moment's notice to the powerful photograph gracing the front cover of Goldberg's book. Nor did I consider how the famous Kent State photograph would affect my daughter. I learned an important lesson that day, one that became apparent once the first questions started about why the man in the picture was lying on the ground. Hesitating momentarily in that parental space of whether truth was the best strategy, I said that the man was hurt. My daughter wanted to know how he was hurt, however, and I replied that he'd been shot by a gun. Slowly, the facts emerged, and it was a university campus. He was a student. I said this is why guns were not good, and my daughter acknowledged that Sailor Moon used special powers rather than guns. My daughter then said that sometimes her eyes got teary, dabbing at her eyes. And I asked if her eyes were watering because of the photograph, and she said yes. I was unsure of what to do, caught off guard by her emotional reaction. And throughout that hour and throughout that evening, including about 4 times in the initial hour, she mentioned how this Kent State photograph was bothering her and dabbing at her eyes each time. In my recollections of my own exposure to harrowing photographs, it is the image of the children running down the road in South Vietnam, fleeing a napalm burning. That's an image that many of you are familiar with, that marks that sort of before and after of traumatic images. For many years, I've been preoccupied with the power of the image, particularly that conveyed through still photography and documentary film form. In particularly, I've sought varying narratives and visual representation of war, conflict, and trauma, questioning whether such representations have power and resonance to pierce through the protective coverings often constructed in navigating our heavily mediated lives. While acknowledging the power considered to reside in images, one must also acknowledge the limitations of the still and moving image and of written text and spoken language. Challenges faced by photojournalists and documentary filmmakers can take place at the level of the audience, in terms of reception. They can be due to the medium itself, and some may reside in the story or the experiences or the psychological states that need to be conveyed. If we're to think of reception, for example, we can have content that's too traumatizing, causing individuals to turn away, the impact being one of overwhelm. And images that I've found in my own study are obviously torture, but evidence of mass slaughter, suffering in the moment. We can also have content that's repetitive in nature, possibly resulting in desensitization. And so we have a numbing effect. It's sort of ho-hum. I've seen it all before. A third potential audience response can be one of voyeurism or titillation, perhaps experiencing a sense of perversion in the viewing of the horrors. So the challenge then in representation involves how do we present material in a manner that will engage viewers, perhaps in a relation of empathy to that viewed, as Rithi Pan would desire, so that we would share responsibility in witness testimony. In terms of representation, some of the challenges that I will be addressing involve experiences that are thought to reside beyond the realms of representation, the unthinkable, the inadequacy of language and imagery to represent, the unrepresentable. And as Brian Winston would state, the received wisdom from the challenges of representing the Holocaust are that it was beyond words, beyond images, beyond even imagination itself. The task becomes creating a visualization of the unreachable. Tied to this is content that can be too traumatizing, and we're going to see efforts by Rithi Pan when he talks about the Cambodian genocide, of how do we represent his experience. Another challenge of representation occurs when there are potential acts of erasure that have happened. Here we may have an archive of atrocity that does not exist anymore, as evidenced in Germany during World War II, where there was a ban on visual evidence of the mass extermination. Tied to this problem is that an archive might exist, but the archive is misrepresentative. And so, again, with the Khmer Rouge, there's extensive propaganda footage, but it's meant to persuade and it's meant to mislead. A final area entails experiences that are hard to reach, hard to visualize, especially in relation to trauma. We can have interior states, states of mind, dream spaces, and nightmares. And we also have memory itself. Memory is dynamic. Memory is inherently unstable. How do we capture the subjective nature of memory? How do we capture false memories, memory suppression, dissociation, post-traumatic stress disorder? So those are some of the challenges that the individuals that I will focus upon today have taken as their challenge in the work that we'll look at. To begin, I'm going to talk about the photojournalist Susan Mimesis, an American photojournalist, and her work here, Kurdistan in the Shadow of History. For this project, Mimesis was challenged by the fact that there is no Kurdistan, no nation to call its own. Additionally, for a very long time, there's been an active suppression in the regions of where Kurdistan would exist. And therefore, there is no official institution responsible to create a national collection. There is no central archive, there's no Library of Congress that one can go to if one wants to trace the historical evolution of this people. Mimesis first went to Kurdistan with Human Rights Watch in April of 1991 as the organization looked to verify stories of the destruction of the Kurdish villages by Saddam Hussein's forces. At the outset of the project, she found the visual images that were either from the West or from Kurds themselves were limited, and they were all focused on young men dressed as warriors. And so this was a kind of a limited narrative that one could tell. And so she realized if she was going to portray this kind of historical evolution of the Kurds, she was going to have to turn to a variety of sources. And it was to this decision that I think the true brilliance of her book lies. Mimesis was able to convey a more thorough understanding of what is primarily a visual story through her turn to a variety of document sources, including, but not limited to, primary documents and sources, declassified documents, telegrams, postcards, letters from grandsons of Kurdish photographers, diaries, letters, photographs from missionaries, colonial administrators, early travelers, academic interest by early anthropologists of the Kurdish people. Here, for example, in the picture we have just prior is the Armenian Massacre, and these are just little postcards that have been placed inside of boxes of chocolates. And so they tell the story of the Armenian Massacre. When you open up your box, you have a little sort of narrative. On the next slide, what we see is the telegram that's announcing that something's happening to the Armenians. And so the American consul is reporting back. So we have this kind of primary document, obviously, attesting to that which has been represented in a postcard form on the previous slide. We have the photograph taken at the time of the individuals that are being rounded up, and the consul itself detailing that sort of an urgent intervention is necessary. Here we have British, once the British are in the Iraq region, these are bombing records, official bombing records as they bomb Baghdad and other areas, and they're celebrating up top, drinking beer. Mimesis also worked really closely with families. She traveled around the region, and people would bring out their family photography books. And there was a huge effort at trying to identify. For 6 years, she would often have documents that she didn't know who the people were. And she created a website where it was an active website that all could go on and try and take part in this active identification. The photographs were constructed by herself. We have regional photographers, international photographers, and even Saddam Hussein's publicity photo. The result is a complex, thorough, textured, photographic and historical portrait. As Mimesis herself states, in no way is the book a definitive history of the Kurds. Texts and images are presented as fragments. It is a book of quotations with multiple and interwoven narratives taken from primary sources, the raw materials from which history is constructed. She states, "A photograph is a document that resists erasure." So I now want to turn to some of the merits of animation. In more recent years, having studied still photography so much, I then was really taken with recent films that have come out as animated documentaries, and there's been a lot of attention now to how they can augment some of the limitations of live action documentary with the realism. In particular, for the talk today, what's really exciting and innovative are their abilities to deal with psychosocial experiencing of trauma. Because obviously we're able to go inside to nightmares and dreams, all of those things that really all you can have is somebody telling, I had a nightmare. So we can visualize in animation what that nightmare might look like. To do this, I'm going to draw our attention to two feature-length animated documentaries from the past few years. The first is the 2008 multi-award-winning and Oscar-nominated Waltz with Bashir by Israeli filmmaker Ari Folman, where Folman recounts the trouble he had remembering his own participation as an Israeli soldier in the First Lebanese War, and in particular the Sabra Shatila refugee camp massacres of 1982. The second is the 2011 Romanian-Polish animated documentary film Krulak the Path to Beyond by Romanian filmmaker Anca Damian. The film presents the story of Claudiu Krulak, a 33-year-old Romanian who died in a Polish prison in 2008 from a hunger strike he had embarked upon in order to prove his innocence of charges of petty theft that had been levied against him. Attention will be given to the ways animation as a form can augment some of the limitations of traditional live-action documentary. In recent years, there's a term, blurred boundaries, that's been used to talk about this form of documentary, where we're obviously in realism and these events have happened, but there's also fictive elements that are introduced as well, and it becomes much of a story. For a moment, we should consider the documentary form itself, especially in terms of issues of truth and creativity. In his early days at the Canadian National Film Board, John Grierson defined documentary as the creative treatment of actuality. Similarly, Paul Ward posits documentary as critical and creative research. Importantly, issues of truth confront truths in debates about the documentary film form. We have the documentary as document, as objective record or recorder of history, and this is contrasted against the documentary as interpretation, as subjective rendering of reality with multiple or competing histories possible. With the animated documentary, the very act of animation draws our attention to the film as a reenactment. Everything that is performed by the animator, they've intervened, and a subjective rendering of reality has been created through the drawn image. Naturally, it's recognized that we cannot step outside of our interpretations of reality. However, animation foregrounds this interpretation in opposition to the camera's seemingly transparency. Critically, with both of these films, the filmmakers only saw their films possible if they were animated. In an oft-quoted statement, Ari Folman commented, "The film was always meant to be animated. I never thought about making it in any other technique. I didn't think the movie would work as a fiction film, and I thought a classic documentary would be boring as hell. I thought if you take all the elements that you see in the film, seen in the first few minutes, dreams, lost memories, subconscious, wars in general, because it's probably the most surreal thing on earth, the only way to combine these together and tell in one storyline would be to draw it and animate it. And it gave me total freedom as a filmmaker. For her part, Anka Damian was also not interested in making a traditional investigative documentary, one that would seek to unearth and interrogate those within the criminal justice, political, and medical bureaucracies in Poland and Romania, whose decisions ultimately led to Krulak's tragic death. Having made the decision to tell the story from Krulak's point of view, remembering that he had passed away at the time Damian even heard of his case, she believed animation would enable her to tell the story, and was in fact the only language that could bring the story to the audience. Fulman himself posits the following 3 questions. Is a digital image consisting of lines and dots and digital information, is it more real? Is a drawn image talking with real sound less real? Who can say? Who is to judge? And further, when he was questioned why he chose animation as a form for Waltz with Bashir instead of a traditional documentary with real people, he answered, "These are real people, they're just drawn." So let us begin the film where the film begins, or let us begin where the film begins, with a nightmare. To this day, I can still recall my reactions to the opening sequence of the film, sitting in a darkened theater, overwhelmed by the intensity of the nightmare portrayed on the screen. 26 very angry dogs run wild through the streets of a cityscape, Tel Aviv, finally stopping at the bottom of a building. A lone man draws aside a curtain and looks down upon the dogs. The scene switches to a bar and a discussion between the filmmaker, Ari Fulman, and Boaz Ryan Buskila, the individual who's recounting his nightmare to Fulman. This beginning for the film is important for several reasons. The event marked the beginning of the film project for Fulman. As soon as the opening scene with the dog concludes, the camera pans to an interior shot, and in this conversation in the present day between Ari and Boaz, we, the viewers, are positioned to receive a very personal film. Fulman not only becomes the film's narrator, but the film is also an examination of him as a much younger man, psychologizing as to the impact of war upon the common soldiers. In terms of trauma and challenges in its portrayal, viewers are immediately aware of the war's traumatic impact upon the subconscious. Boaz is experiencing a recurrent nightmare that began 20 years after the massacre. And Fulman is experiencing a lack of flashbacks and proclaims that he never even thinks about the Sabra Shatila refugee camp massacres. Fulman bids his friend goodbye and has his first flashback to the camps after his meeting with Boaz. It is now Fulman's turn to seek the aid of a psychoanalyst friend to point the pathway forward. In this meeting, complexities to the memory process are introduced, including the idea that memories can be false. However, Fulman is encouraged to seek out those who were with him in Lebanon in 1982 with the reassurance: our minds have a way of protecting us from entering dark and totally dangerous recollections. Our minds will only take us as far as we're capable of going. From this point onwards, the film, while animated and highly surreal, fits a formal category of nonfiction film. Fulman asked the question of what happened to Israeli soldiers like himself at Sabra and Shatila, and proceeds through interviews with friends, other soldiers, journalists, and a few who can offer more scientific insights into the workings of human memory and post-traumatic stress disorder to answer this question. What I find critical about the film is not the structure, a structure one could find replicated in traditional live-action documentaries, but instead the choice of animation as the strategy for representing the common soldier's experience, presenting a powerful reckoning of post-traumatic stress disorder. If we're to think about affect and animation, most critical given the memories and nightmares being recounted was the visual evidence animation provided. If we think about the opening of the film, for example, the nightmare is illustrated in order to have intense emotional potency, and that is to encourage a visceral response in the viewer. In an article entitled Political Mimesis, Jane Gaines draws our attention to the ability of films to make their appeals to our senses through our senses. Mimesis is a body-first way of knowing. So beginning with the body, we must pay attention to the relations between the bodies on screen and the bodies of ourselves. A starting point then in terms of film reception becomes what one body makes the other body do. And we know this from our reactions to other genres such as horror, melodrama, and pornography. Given this, one can understand Fulman's drive to his animators to continuously make the images more powerful, more potent. And indeed, so sophisticated was the animation for the opening sequence that Fulman held off its construction for 18 months after the film had begun to be put together, believing only then were the animators qualified enough to tackle the challenge. Depending on the needs of the storyline, Fulman was also able to vary the style and the tone of animation. At times, he adhered with incredible veracity to the real image, and at other times, the artists were permitted freedom in giving visual expressiveness to the operations of the subconscious. Animation allowed aspects of war to be conveyed, such as dream sequences, nightmares, and surreal visions. And they successfully grappled with issues of post-traumatic stress disorder. Indeed, the whole movie can be viewed as a working through of trauma on the part of Fulman himself. And the animators called it post-traumatic sketch disorder. We see the coping mechanisms of soldiers and veterans, and personal responsibilities for atrocity, and the place of guilt. Critically, as I've said, the film was able to explore the nature and complexities of memory. And what we're going to see, we're going to have 3 clips here. Obviously, the film is successful at showing the complex process of memory recovery. The first clip that we're going to see is the first flashback that Fullman has. Here he's just visited one of his soldier mates in Amsterdam, and he's in a taxi on the way to the airport. And he's looking out the window, and as only animation can do, we're going to see the landscape of Holland transform into the landscape of Lebanon. So the next shots show that the tank getting hit. And in this scene, we have, affect is central to this scene. There's such incredible realism with the images of the helicopters, the light shimmering off the cloth, laying over the bodies of the dead. The darkened tones allow for us to see the red of the blood that gets swept from the personal carrier.
We unload the bodies mechanically as if we are not even really there doing what we are doing. Then we turn around and drive off.
Joshua Hurst comments about trauma discourse and says, trauma discourse is less defined by content than by an attempt to discover a form for representing that context that mimics some aspects of post-traumatic consciousness itself. In the next clip, we're going to see what is called by Fullman himself when he describes his movie, the super scene of the film. And it's a scene that he returns to 3 times throughout the film. It's actually a false memory, but we don't really know that till much later in the film.
My meeting with Boaz took place in the winter of 2006. That very night, for the first time in 20 years, I experienced a flashback to the war in Lebanon. Not just Lebanon, West Beirut. Not just Beirut, but the massacre at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps.
In our final clip from Ari Folman, he has gone to now an expert on post-traumatic stress disorder because he's quite worried. He's traveled to many people and can't understand why he can't remember. People will say to him, "You were there." So she explains to him the workings of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is my favorite, I think, clip of the film. It's just beautifully rendered.
Is it even possible that I can't remember such a dramatic event?
We call them dissociative events. It's when a person experiences a situation and yet they perceive themselves as outside of it. In 1983, I had a patient who was a photographer, and I asked him, "How did you survive that grueling war?" He replied simple, "I saw it as nothing more than a day trip." He told himself, "Wow, what fantastic action scenes. Shooting, artillery, wounded people screaming everywhere." He saw everything as if he were viewing it through an imaginary camera. Then something happened. His camera broke. He said that when the camera broke, he stopped seeing the situation as fantastic and it became traumatic for him. When he finally got near the stables in Beirut,
The hippodrome.
he saw a huge number of carcasses of slaughtered Arabian horses. "This broke my heart," he said. "What had those poor horses done to deserve such suffering?" He couldn't handle seeing those dead horses with his real eyes. He had used the camera to remain outside real events, as if he were watching the war on film. This protected him. Once he was forced to see them with his own eyes, he could no longer deny reality. The horror consumed him, and he freaked out.
In terms of content that's too traumatizing, we know there's going to be a difference between animation and live action documentary, with animation allowing Folman to go into some very dark places, aided by the techniques of color. Two scenes stand out in special regard in this sense. A fellow veteran in Holland recounts being taken to a slaughterhouse during the storming of Beirut, where Palestinians were taken for interrogation, and body parts in jars with formaldehyde were sold. During the Sabra Shatila massacre, we see shots of individuals lined up against the wall and gunned down by Christian phalangists. Typically, such footage would be perceived as too ethically problematic to be included in a live-action documentary, too painful, too real for viewers to be able to contest the veracity, the objectivity of those images. This is contrasted against the image when drawn, and hence perceived from a place of subjectivity. As such, it's assumed that the viewer can be distanced, a bit distanced from the impact of the image. To conclude my talk of Waltz with Bashir, Folman said he was trying to make an anti-war film and really wanted to highlight the experiences of the everyday soldier. A critical decision then was to move away from this sort of surreal nature of personal recollection to a much more straightforward journalistic reportorial style of what really happened in the camps. We're led by the voice and eyes of Israeli journalist Ron Ben Yishai, his animated bearing of witness recreated through animation. There is a powerful emotive triggering of his own daughter when he gazes at the curls of the girl trapped in the rubble. During this chronology of massacre, the color palette is darkened throughout the segment, aiming for a monochromatic look and melancholic tone. At the conclusion of the film, however, Folman moves to live action archival footage. Not only do we see the real counterparts to the grieving women that had moved past Fulman in his first remembrance, but we also see the carnage, the bodies of the victims, the men, women, and children, with the final image of the film being a close-up of a young boy who's died. There are to be no heroes in war, and this event really happened. Fulman chooses the still photograph to cement our bearing of witness to this past atrocity. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip over Krulak because I don't think I have enough time. And so if you bear with me, I'm just going to move ahead here. There we go. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Rithi Pan, or you might not. He has a prolific documentary and some fictional film work to his name. The film I'm going to talk about is a 2013 film, The Missing Picture, which is a very, very personal, autobiographical remembrance of his teenage years in Cambodia while he witnessed and endured the genocidal project of the Khmer Rouge regime. Attention here is to the aesthetic form that he's chosen, which is a very unusual combination of forms in order to give visible and palpable representation of his traumatized memory and experience. Challenges of the lack of an archive from the Khmer Rouge, but also their propagandistic one, are also tackled straightforwardly by Pan, who's going to repurpose the existing archive that has been left by the Khmer Rouge in a kind of narrative redirection of its meaning. The Khmer Rouge genocide haunts all of Rithi Pan's work. In the communist revolutionary period from 1975 to 1979, it's estimated that about 2 million Cambodians were systematically destroyed by means of starvation, overwork, torture, and execution. A survivor himself, Pan lost his parents and many in his immediate and surrounding family, but managed to escape a Khmer Rouge labor camp in 1979, crossing into a Thai refugee camp before making his way to France as a teenage refugee. There, he was eventually accepted into the French National Cinema School. Summarizing his overall portfolio, Pan states, "Sometimes one film is like many films put together, and sometimes a collection of films is like one series of memories around a single subject. I cannot answer all of the questions that the genocide asks of us. But I try to provide some response. If you watch S-21, the Khmer Rouge Death Machine, and then you see Dutch Master of the Forges of Hell, and later The Missing Picture, hopefully, gradually, you can begin to understand a bit better." In 2013, Pan released a memoir, a book co-written, entitled The Elimination. A survivor of the Khmer Rouge confronts his past and the commandant of the killing fields, tracing Pan's encounter with Dutch, head of the S-21 detention center. This memoir became the inspiration for The Missing Picture. We can view The Missing Picture as a hybrid film and a personal lament. Using its particular form of in-betweenness, it powerfully contests official and hegemonic visions of history through the missing picture it provides, at the same time as giving expression to individual grief and suffering. On the one hand, the ideological vision conveyed in Khmer Rouge produced propaganda films and revolutionary slogans is turned on its head when inserted into his film. With the many missing pictures functioning as the actuality behind the revolutionary edicts, propagandistic instruction, and ideological indoctrination. At the same time, the film's narrative, written from reconstructed memories of a young teenage boy as remembered in middle age, maintain a searing, intimate portrait of sustained exposure to trauma and atrocity. In addition to representing the complications of memory as traumatic, as testimony, and as transcendence over the horrors endured. The meaning of the film's title can be read on multiple levels. The project began when Pan immersed himself in a study of Khmer Rouge propaganda film, or propaganda footage. He became aware of the images of an execution that a former photographer claimed to have shot. This footage, the missing picture, the archival evidence of an act committed within the scope of a much larger genocide, was never found by Pan. However, as he searched for this footage, questions about the limitations of the realist photograph weighed on him. The search for the image became important to me, he said, as a record, but I also asked myself whether an image can ever really tell the truth. An image is not the truth, even if it's taken from a final act like an execution. It cannot tell the full truth. Part of the picture will always be missing. Pan worked on the subject for a year and then decided to see his ancestral home in Phnom Penh, a place he had not returned to since 1975. The home itself had been turned into a brothel and a karaoke bar, and Pan asked his assistant to build a scale model of the home as Pan remembered it, and asked him to make some figurines of Pan as he would have been in early adolescence. And it was when Pan saw the glazed figure that his idea of the film changed completely. The missing picture took on more meanings. It was a family universe that no longer existed. It was a vibrant Cambodian culture. In telling of the missing picture, Pan was challenged to create a cinematic discourse of history without archival image to anchor it. Confronted by the Khmer Rouge's attempts at their genocidal project, save the meticulously kept mugshots of those entering but not leaving the S-21 detention center, plus the missing pictures of starvation and death, plus the iconographic record from the Khmer Rouge of dubious merit, Pan turned to a method of recreation perhaps without precedence: clay figures set up in elaborate tableaux. Pan worked very closely with the carver, knowing that identification and empathy with these clay figures would be carried by the expressiveness and emotionality conveyed on their faces. Audiences could then see their humanity. Part of this task of transference is accomplished through camera techniques. Life is imparted cinematically. So we get slow panning shots of figurines in their tableau, or close-ups of facial expressions. The use of music, sound effects, and silence are all central. And the very personal narrative, poetic, measured, first person. We see these techniques coming together in a very important carving, that of Pan's father.
With clay and with water, with the dead, with rice fields, with living hands, a man is made. It doesn't take much, it just takes will. His suit is white, his tie is dark. I want to hold him close. He is my father.
In addition to the use of clay figures, Pan relies on the existing archival records in order to tell his story. But he must reappropriate the Khmer Rouge archival footage. And the footage is then used to lend authenticity and complexity to these painted tableaux. In the following, we're going to see a lively tableau where Pan relays memories of the reveries with which he as a child hung out in the film studios with a director neighbor. The world is destroyed, he says. The cinemas were closed, the artists were executed, the singers, technicians, and directors were sent to the fields. As the reel of film that Pan as a young boy so eagerly views catches fire, the narrative announces, a Khmer Rouge film is always a slogan. A clay figure with a motion picture camera pans to show the viewer black and white Khmer Rouge film footage featuring long lines of Cambodian laborers endlessly engaged in manual labor. It's footage that will be returned to repeatedly throughout the film. The innocence of pre-war cinema is juxtaposed against the propagandistic intent of the Khmer Rouge, the latter's meaning inverted through its placement. Pan also uses a montage of film forms. There is a complexity of film techniques used in the film where each aesthetic choice reinforces the affective potency and holistic truth value of the overall scene when combined together. We can see this in the film's first tableau, an extended family, maybe not. So here he is in Phnom Penh before the Khmer Rouge arrive. So we see Pan as the little figure being wheeled around in the streets of Phnom Penh. And here's some activities at home. The overlay is, I remember how sweet life was. Archival news footage follows with the announcement, then came the war. Black and white footage of palm trees aflame, a woman pleading for her life. People grieving over bodies laid out on the stretchers. These images lead into the arrival of the Khmer Rouge and the subsequent emptying of the city and evacuation of city inhabitants into the countryside. Real film footage of a train conductor, train tracks, and images of people walking along the train tracks are interspersed with clay figures in a rail car. Film footage of a Cambodian landscape playing in the background. The narrator announces, Phnom Penh's deportation is a missing picture. In terms of affect and its impact, the missing picture is profound. As the film progresses and the genocide manifests itself, different approaches to storytelling are utilized. One is to show the horrors by indirection. And the other is to relay Pan's personal experiences through tableau.
A 9-year-old boy denounces his mother for picking mangoes. The child shouts, "The comrade has recognized her crime." His mother weeps softly. To confess is to accept to die, for the revolution to be just. When humans will be free and equal to this degree, will they still be humans? The mother closes her eyes. Is it to picture her child? She says nothing. Then she is taken into the forest by guards, never to return.
It is hard to imagine that a scene comprised of very small clay figures can bring tears to one's eyes. Yet in a similar construction to Alain Resnais with Night and Fog, As the film moves through time and the experiences Pan endured, the atrocities, hardship, and human indignities become more acute. In terms of testimony, it goes without saying that the central achievement of this film is giving visibility and testimony to that previously suppressed. Whether the personal universe of Pan's immediate family or the vibrant Cambodian culture flourishing in a pre-Khmer Rouge era, juxtaposed against state propaganda announcing the merits of the revolution, Pan painstakingly recreates the missing pictures of loss of identity. The mass starvation and death that followed, the grueling immersion into the countryside, the hard labor and work camps, and finally to images that would not or should not be conveyed in realist form, the executions of those not fitting into the new revolutionary society. In terms of traumatized memory, Pan's traumatic memories are woven into a less than linear narrative structure, mimicking the process of post-traumatic memory. Pan himself provides evidence of hypermnesia as a result of his exposure to trauma, where the past is too immediate, and where memories are perhaps uninvited but seize consciousness all the same. This is symbolized in the film by ocean waves crashing repeatedly into the lens of the camera, pointing to the overwhelming nature of memories of the past being endured in the present. The film's opening narrative alerts us to this hypermnesia. In the middle of life, childhood returns. The water is sweet and bitter. I seek my childhood like a lost picture, or rather, it seeks me. Is it because I'm 50? Because I've seen troubled times where fear alternates with hope? The memory is there now, pounding at my temples. I'd like to get rid of it. Throughout the missing picture, it's evident that for Pan as a boy, the act of remembrance was an act of transcendence. Memories of the goodness of his past enabled him to survive his present, lifting his mind out of and away from atrocities witnessed and personally endured. Although Pan as an adult expresses his lament or fatigue with the past's embrace of his psychic presence, the very fact that he remembers and is actively engaged in giving narrative expression to these memories is an act of political resistance in the face of his historical erasure.
She sleeps next to me, her belly swollen, her expression blank. She sighs. She calls her mother. She calls her father. Then she calls no more, and we buried her. The 2 other children died soon afterward. I wish to be rid of this picture of hunger and suffering, so I show it to you.
The obvious intervention of the human hand is immediately subsumed by the still photo that then arrests and holds our attention, transference from artifice to still image and back again. We then see the death of Pan's mother, sharing the burdens of his memories while aiding in the political and cultural necessities of testimony and collective remembrance of the impacts of genocide, conclude the film and are echoed in the narrative. There are many things that man should not see or know. Should he see them, he'd be better off dying. But should one of us see or know them, then he must live to tell of them. A political film should unearth what it invented. And so I made this picture. I look at it, I cherish it, I hold it in my hand like a beloved face. This missing picture I now hand over to you so that it never cease to seek us out. The extermination is made visible, and the invitation to the further task of collective remembrance is extended. Thank you.